woodland, hills and rough terrain in northeast France, which also extends into Belgium, Luxembourg and Germany. The success of the German approach through this area took the French by surprise, as it had not occurred to them that mechanized forces would be able to function in such difficult terrain. However, it was to the south of this region at Sedan, 6 miles from the Belgian border, where hundreds of German tanks were able to penetrate into France, crossing the River Meuse, which allowed them to bypass the French fortification system, the infamous Maginot Line. Ineffective Allied counterattacks did not stop the German mechanized forces, enabling them to entrap the British and French, who were unable to respond in strength to German attacks in the north. This underestimation of German strength and mobility proved to be disastrous. Lord Gort, commander of the BEF and working to a 1914 to 1918 timetable, expected that he would have 2 or 3 weeks to prepare for the Germans to travel 65 miles. The Germans would actually arrive in 4 days. On the 5th of June, the second act of the Battle of France began, with a major offensive from Germany which saw heavy fighting in the area of the Somme. This fight began with the Germans invading the region to the south of this important river. The French put up a considerable defence, and the German losses were substantial, in spite of their enormous numerical superiority. Once again, the German army relied on the Luftwaffe to help, by silencing French guns and enabling German infantry and tanks to move forward. 3 days later, the French had been overwhelmed and began withdrawing their troops from the area. The situation for France worsened progressively. On the 10th of June, the Italian dictator Mussolini joined forces with Germany, declaring war on Britain and France. On the 11th of June, the Germans launched a major offensive on the French capital, Paris, 1 day after it had been declared an open city. With the French line of resistance broken in several places around Paris, the French government was forced to flee to Bordeaux. France, by now, had become a politically divided country. On the 16th of June, its then Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, resigned and was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain. The following day, Pétain appealed to the French troops to stop fighting and addressed the French citizens on the radio, announcing that he would seek an armistice with Germany. Spasmodic skirmishes continued for a few days, but on the 22nd of June, France surrendered. Hitler insisted on signing the document of capitulation at Compiègne Forest in the same railway carriage that was used for the 1918 armistice that had ultimately ended the First World War. The humiliation of France continued with its division. Pétain's control was limited to the south, his capital at Vichy in central France. The Germans, in return, occupied northern France and France's entire Atlantic coastline, down to the border with Spain. That said, the Germans did not have everything their way during the summer of 1940. The French put up a courageous fight throughout, including against the enemy encircling Dunkirk at the end of May, when more than 250,000 Allied troops were successfully transported out of the war-torn area in an operation known now as the evacuation of Dunkirk. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, this evacuation of troops began on the 27th of May 1940 and was completed by the 4th of June. It could have been one of the worst disasters in military history. Still trapped by the Germans and depleted of military resources by the blitzkrieg, the BEF was essentially at the mercy of the German Luftwaffe, which did its best to prevent the seaborne evacuation. However, the Germans did not take into account the negative effect that sand on the beaches would have on its bombs, or of the unstinting support from many French and Belgian civilians who came to the aid of British troops. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay masterminded the hastily prepared operation on the British side. He mobilized an assortment of vessels, including passenger ferry steamers, Thames barges and tugs, to take the beleaguered servicemen back home. The Dutch, too, came to the assistance of the BEF, providing around 40 passenger ships from the Royal Navy. However, it was soon realized that many more, shallower craft were required than the Navy could supply to ferry personnel from the beaches out to these larger craft waiting offshore. Ramsay made an emergency call on the radio for additional help from private boat owners throughout Britain. They responded admirably. On the first full day of the evacuation, 7,669 men had been evacuated. By the 9th day, a total of 338,226 servicemen had been returned to England, in a fleet of over 800 boats, in which nearly 400 small craft with civilian seafarers had